I'm Jamie Willis, and this is my Module 3 Reflection, Universal Design for Learning. First of all, I asked the question, what is universal design for learning? And found out through our research that it is an approach to teaching and learning that focuses on flexibility to the curriculum, improving access to information, and improving access to learning. It brought me to this quote that I thought was interesting. Teachers, I believe, are the most responsible and important members of society because their professional efforts affect the fate of the earth. So Helen Caldicott said this. She's an author and peace activist, and it made me believe that we do have this much potential power. And if every educator believed that they have this much potential power, we could see really big changes in education. So back to our universal design for learning and how does this apply to that is that we have to change our ways. We have to change what we're doing in the classroom. And there were three broad principles to ensure that learning is happening in the classroom that was brought out by UDL. And those three principles go to multiple presentations. We have to be sure that we understand how the student is going to perceive what we are presenting to them, the language and symbols that we are presenting to them, and how well they're going to be able to comprehend our presentations. Secondly, we have to allow them different ways to express their learning. We have to allow them to express it with physical actions. They need to be able to express in fluency if that is their strength. And then also executive functions, meaning they can self-manage maybe a longer project, hands-on, or a longer research paper or something of that nature. Then we also need to supply multiple motivators to them. We obviously have to recruit their interest in the very beginning. We have to be able to have them buy in and sustain that effort throughout our class period or class project week or however long our goal-oriented task would be lasting. And then self-regulation, having them to be able to report on their findings and self-evaluate their learning. So, our successful learning environment should include supports and challenges for the students. So, there are some key terms that keep coming up through my reading and through the YouTube videos, and that was flexibility, scaffolding, and choice. When it comes to students, we have to be flexible in the ways that we can teach them, the ways that we accept their learning. We have to be able to scaffold them in ways to support the basic skills, as well as scaffolding up for more challenging um, projects and procedures. And then also we have to be able to allow them more choice. We also have to be able to minimize the barriers. And again, we see some of these same terms, flexibility here, scaffolding, and then versatility, which versatility comes to mimic over here choice. So our versatility is not only in the way that we teach, but in the materials that we use. The materials that we choose to use should be very versatile for our children. So how do I do this? So this is my part of my reflection. I took in all of that information, and then I think, how do I apply this to me and my classroom? Some of these things I'm already doing. Some of these things I need to do a little more of. So what do I do first? Well, here's my machine. I already have the bicycle. I have universal design of learning outlined. So I need to use the guidelines of UDL. I need to implement some changes, and I need to observe differences with my kids. So those differences can be qualitative as well as quantitative. It may be that they're more engaged, they are more pleased with their effort, they are more actively learning in the classroom. But then I also need to be able to quantitate that learning as well on formative assessments and summative assessments. Are they actually proving and meeting the goal that I want them to meet? So those are some things that I should keep in mind when implementing some of these guidelines of UDL in my classroom. So the first principle of UDL is that recommends that the teacher provide multiple representations of the same information. So the presentation that I give must look at different ways to display the information. look at different ways to clarify the information, as well as ways to activate information. Multiple ways to present the material, when I think of in my classroom, is to use text and strategies. That's one way to present some information to students. We don't do all of our information through text, but when I do try to print those things out. I try to make sure they're on different reading levels if necessary. I also try to use highlighters and annotative uh, tactics in order to be able to write directly on the text, in order to look at what we are given and try to pull the main ideas and the key information from. Use discussion. So this was something like think, pair, share, which I feel like in my classroom I probably don't do enough of, because I feel like I teach high school. I teach ninth graders mostly, and sometimes those discussions get a little off task and hard to wrangle back. But think, pair, share is a great way if you time that and use it directly. It's a really good way to allow them to discuss their information. Use graphs and charts. So this can be where I give them graphs and charts that they have to interpret. It can be giving information where we create our own graphs and charts, or labs where we create our own graphs and charts. It can also be using our text and the strategies that we use to read and make graphic organizers and flow charts and Venn diagrams would work to present this material as well. Another way is to tie to prior knowledge. It makes it so important that we tie to what we already know, and make things relevant to the real world. Zooming in on main ideas and big concepts. I find that previously, when I was a younger teacher than I am now, I've have 21 years now. So when I was in my first couple years teaching, I probably was a little more concerned with the little details rather than the big concepts. But I've found through some experience that the more that I focus on the main ideas and the big concepts, then the small key details and key vocabulary and things come into play if the main focus stays on the big ideas. And using memory tools. There are different memory tools and mnemonic devices that I use throughout the years to help my students if they have to memorize certain lists or orders of things, that help the students with that. So the second principle of UDL recommends that the teacher provide multiple flexible methods of expression and apprenticeship. So how can my students express to me that they have learned the information that I have tried to teach to them? And so the three things that I thought, well, they can do it. They can do the hands-on, they can say it, they can verbalize it either with written communication or verbal communication, and they can manage it. So we can extend on into project level, long term goals, and they can manage maybe a project. So multiple ways of student expression. The first thing is that I think of, I teach science, and so is labs and demonstrations. And I can scaffold these labs and demonstrations to meet the needs of my individual learners in the classroom. If it's something that I need to keep really, really structured, I can do as a teacher demonstration, maybe with some volunteers pulled up, or I can go table to table and do individual little demonstrations. Labs, I can again scaffold to give step-by-step guidelines of things to do, or I can give a basket of materials and a big concept and have the students be a little more creative and create the steps themselves of how they would go about testing the information. We can build models, and I can scaffold this as well. We can build models where I make a model and they can mimic my model. Going through the process is valuable for some of those students. Or we can lend it to say, okay, well, here's the concept, here's our goal. So you build a model that represents that, and that gives a little higher level thinking. Scenarios and simulations, scenarios from role playing and acting out in the classroom, as well as using virtual simulations. The one that I have on the screen right now is a PhET simulation, PhET, from the University of Colorado, and I use this a lot in my classroom. But there are a lot of games and interactive simulations that you can do in the classroom as well. Another way is to write it down. So students can write or type and turn in some sort of written expression to show that they have mastered a skill. They can verbalize, they can talk it out. They can talk it out with partners. We can give oral presentations in the class. There are so many ways virtually that students can record their information now. There are tons of apps and video conferencing things that you can do with the students. There's something called Recap that's really cool, where the students can video their short answers and they can send it to you virtually. Or you can go old-fashioned. I like to have one-on-one discussions with my students while they are in labs or doing something individually. I'll walk around and talk to them and maybe have them even answer the essential question verbally to me each day. Making a visual. This is really important, whether it's artistic or a visual representation. If a student feels led to, they're very artistic, and that's a strength. That's some options that you can give them. You can even make the visual be, a graphic display for use of technology. It doesn't have to be a pencil and paper version, but it can be. And then, of course, projects. I'm currently working on science fair projects with my students, and these projects are very long term. And ways that we can scaffold this in the classroom, or that I scaffold it for my students, is I've made a huge interactive checklist, and they have certain points that they have to meet, and those are due dates. And they are able to work with groups or by themselves. So there's a lot of choice there, and there's also a lot of choice with their topics that they could choose as well. So motivators. If the student is not motivated, then obviously there's going to be some issues in trying to teach them the information. So it is our job to provide multiple flexible options for engagement here. So that means that I have to bring them in some way. I have to make it, generally if you can make it authentic and real, that helps. Keep them engaged. So having short-term goals, especially if it is a project that is long-term, keeping them engaged somewhere along the way and accountable helps them to stay a little focused. And then encourage them to take control. Encourage them to become the CEOs of their group or the CEOs of their own learning, and help them to understand that they can take control of their project and they can take it in a different direction sometimes as well. Multiple ways to motivate. First of all, I found very, very powerful is to allow choice of the topics that they are doing. Any amount of choice or any level of choice that I can give them will give them more control and engagement of the topic. Making the tasks that they have authentic and safe. So their tasks that they have, or the goals that they have, to be really authentic, really real world based. The closer I can make it to reality, the better and the more motivated they seem to stay. Also, safety, allowing them to choose how they're going to prove their learning gives them a safety net. If someone is terrified of giving oral presentations, the focus is going to be constantly on the oral presentation if I have them do an oral presentation. But if that same student can do a research paper, and that's where they feel they are very safe and they have the choice to do that, they're going to be more motivated and focused on the learning instead of the fear of having to stand up in front of their peers. I think that's a common one. Offer challenge and support. So ways that I do this is to give bigger ideas and maybe even choice ideas that I'm not sure can really happen, and then give them support or give them some big ideas where and motivate them that they can go out and they can make those changes. And then there's support along the way. I can be there as a tutor, as a helper, and checklists and organization. Those are all good. Offer chances to collaborate. And I think as students, a lot of students like this, but also I found that students prefer to have the chance to also work alone. Sometimes they really value that alone time to be able to work by themselves. Support goal setting and achieving. So I use the term goals in class and allow them to say, this is our end goal and how are we going to get there? and how they get there, if it's their choice, seems to motivate them along the way. Supporting larger tasks that go beyond. Then this kind of goes back to offering challenge and support to the student, those tasks that are beyond what is necessarily required, giving them those big ideas or allowing them to come up with their own big ideas and supporting them and acknowledging that they're doing that. I think a lot of students really, really are motivated by the acknowledgement that they are going above and beyond their classmates, and they like to be recognized for that. And then the last thing is to support self-reflection and peer review. I teach science, and so I've gone to several STEM conferences and state science conferences. And one thing that they focus on is tinker time. So it's part of that engineering process of where you build something, and if it doesn't work, you're not just done. And you actually can take the prototype or whatever you're building and tinker with it and move it around and change materials and change aspects of it to make it work better. Where you can also look at peers and what they are doing and how they are successful and learn from them. It is huge that we give more time for self-reflection and peer reviews in class. So that brings me to this quote that anyone who stops learning is old, whether at 20 or 80. Anyone who keeps learning stays young. That's from Henry Ford. And so we, as the teachers, as the old ones, have to continue to learn. So that brings me to my responsibility. My responsibility is to continue to learn. And that responsibility is to my colleagues, to my students, and to our world. If I do not continue to learn and learn new ways to try and reach my students, then I have failed them. So it is ultimately my responsibility in my classroom to make the changes to allow my students to be the most successful that they can possibly be. My resources, picture resources, credits. This is from Slides Carnival. Super cool. And presentation and design. Thank you.